At dawn, two clocks began to tick. One in Washington, ruthless and cold, counting down 48 hours for a nation to surrender 60% of its gold and oil. The other in Ouagadougou, forged in defiance, giving 72 hours for foreign companies to bend or break under new rules written not abroad but at home. Two ultimatums, two worlds colliding on the same page of history. This was not a polite negotiation. It was not a letter to be filed away. It was a strike against sovereignty itself, answered with a signature that turned resistance into law. No carve-outs, no appeals, no delay. The question was stark. Would Burkina Faso be bent by the weight of dollars withheld, or would the Sahel's soil harden into stone? Do not look away. What comes next may shift how Africa is seen forever. Stay with us, subscribe, and follow this story as each hour unfolds. Because this is more than a standoff. It is a test measured in hours, in courage, in grain trucks and wages, in the silence of radios waiting for the first crack. The countdown has begun, and history waits to see which clock will strike last. At dawn, the message from Washington fell like a hammer on the table. 48 hours. Hand over 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil reserves, or lose access to the dollar and face punitive clawbacks. No meetings, no appeals. It was the language of command, not of partnership. By nightfall, a second hammer struck. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader in Ouagadougou, signed his own ultimatum. 72 hours. Either foreign operators submit to Burkina Faso's revised mining laws, or their pipelines, fields, and permits would be frozen. No carve-outs, no exceptions, no extensions. The words were simple, but their weight was monumental. A duel of clocks had begun, 48 against 72. In those first hours, the contrast was stark. Washington moved through banks and wire systems, pressing on the arteries of finance. Traoré moved through ground and soil, activating ministries, checkpoints, and the military chain of command already prepared for this moment. His order was not improvisation, it was execution. 5 directives, sharp and unmistakable, were stamped into existence. Exports were frozen. Every mine was to be audited. Foreign private security was to be replaced with national forces. Control of digital servers and sensitive data was to be seized and brought home. And all new reporting had to run through central state channels. Within minutes, sealed packets carried the orders to mining headquarters. Within hours, phones in the capital rang with terse instructions. On the ground, the shift was visible. At one site, a state officer placed a suspension notice on a foreign manager's desk. Credentials switched hands, access codes changed, and the server keys were logged into government custody. At another site, drones buzzed above, recording stockpiles, checking manifests against new national formats. Convoys of trucks that once rolled freely were stopped at dusk, papers scrutinized, escorts turning back those who could not comply. This was not theater, it was enforcement. Markets, courtyards, and bus stops across the nation became listening posts. Radios carried hourly updates, the air heavy with both fear and pride. For ordinary citizens, the 72-hour order was not an abstract idea. It was real, felt in the silence of idling engines, in the checkpoints delaying shipments, in the sight of soldiers and engineers standing guard together. The authority of the state was suddenly tangible, pulsing through villages and mines alike. Foreign operators, long accustomed to privilege, hesitated. Some complied quickly, recognizing the cost of defiance. Others threatened withdrawal, calculating that Washington's 48-hour cutoff might deliver them rescue. But Burkina Faso was not seizing equipment or expelling workers overnight. It was redrawing the rules of the game and demanding compliance in real time. For the people, the shift was a mix of tension and resolve. Elders opened radio channels for alerts. Young engineers adapted drones from commercial kits into surveillance tools, weaving together a crude but functional network of early warning. Miners camped overnight by their stockpiles, not as laborers but as guardians of national wealth. It was rough, improvised, but effective. Hour by hour, reports streamed back to the control room in Ouagadougou. Green markers lit up for sites in compliance, yellow for those under review, red for those resisting. Slowly, the map shifted. Pockets of defiance shrank, though not fast enough to guarantee victory. The 72-hour order was holding, but outside the walls of the capital, another countdown advanced. For while Traoré's decree spread across the mines and fields, Washington's clock ticked toward its 48th hour. Banks tested transactions. Transfers stalled. Rumors spread that cash could dry up overnight. It was a duel not of words but of systems, one rooted in the soil, the other in the wires of global finance. And as both clocks ticked louder, the world began to watch. Was this the moment a small Sahelian nation would bend beneath the pressure of dollars withheld? Or would the 72 stand firm long enough to make the 48 irrelevant? The question hung in the air unanswered as the hours bled away. The first day ended not with resolution, but with two clocks still ticking, one in Washington, one in Ouagadougou, and the certainty that when they collided, something far greater than a contract would be decided. Hour 20. The lights inside the control room glowed red, yellow, and green. Reports poured in, thick and fast. Most minds were edging toward compliance, yet patches of resistance still blinked defiantly on the map. But beyond the numbers, the pressure was visible in the streets. Trucks stalled at checkpoints, villagers whispered about sabotage, and ministers demanded answers. Then the first flare struck. A fire erupted at a fuel depot on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, contained swiftly, but the message was unmistakable. This was no accident. Investigators traced suspicious activity back to foreign-linked contractors. Within days, two officials were removed from their posts for facilitating covert transfers. Sabotage had entered the picture, not as speculation but as fact. The government responded with urgency. Armored patrols circled depots. Engineers secured substations. Drones, once used to monitor stockpiles, now scanned highways and pipelines. The air of normal commerce gave way to a tense silence. Every movement felt like a test, every delay like a probe against the system's resilience. Meanwhile, the 48-hour clock loomed larger. At hour 32, the blow landed. Test transfers through New York were blocked. Banks confirmed that channels were frozen, revenue pipelines severed. Panic stirred among operators, traders, and even officials. What was once a theoretical threat had now become machinery in motion. No trucks, no exports, no cash. Inside the control room, advisors whispered of collapse. Without the dollar, salaries might halt, imports stall, and the entire order collapsed like sand. Yet Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. He ordered the creation of a backup grid. Regional banks in the Sahel were tapped for settlement. Gold was fast-tracked for barter swaps. Even bartering grain and fuel was considered. It was raw. It was clumsy, but it kept oxygen flowing through the economy while the main artery was being squeezed. For the miners, the government issued emergency stipends backed not by dollars, but by gold credits redeemable locally. Foreign media mocked the move as primitive, a regression into barter. But on the ground, in the dust of Kaya and the markets of Ouagadougou, the story sounded different. A miner held up his slip and declared, "At least we are still working." In villages, when the first convoys rerouted through Sahel banks arrived with sacks of grain, people cheered. The system was fragile, but it was functioning. The tension mounted with every passing hour. Radios blared two opposing stories: international outlets predicting collapse, national broadcasts insisting the transition was on track. Shopkeepers counted thinner stacks of cash. Truckers sat idle by their vehicles. Mothers weighed food with sharper caution. Yet under the surface, resilience thickened. Villagers guarded depots at night. Young engineers converted consumer drones into a surveillance net. Elders passed warnings across community radios. By hour 45, Ouagadougou was a city suspended between two truths. Foreign reports painted a picture of isolation, while on the ground, new circuits of survival were being patched together. That night, when analysts predicted the final cutoff would arrive, the control room waited in silence. Then came news. The People's Resource Fund received its first direct deposit from gold delivered through Sahel routes, bypassing blocked wires entirely. Cheers erupted in the room. Not salvation, but survival. Yet the pressure did not relent. At hour 50, headlines across Europe announced suspension of major foreign consortium operations. Traders speculated against Burkina Faso's currency. Food prices spiked. Petrol lines lengthened. Still, Traoré addressed his advisors with steel. "This is a sovereignty test," he declared. "If they cannot operate under our law, they will not operate here." The words, broadcast across tea shops and courtyards, became a refrain of defiance. Outside, the streets bore the strain. Families paid more for bread, taxi drivers refused long trips, and whispers of sanctions filled the air. Inside, the state tightened its grip. Sabotage teams attempting to tamper with a power station were caught. Their capture splashed across radios with the message, "Sabotage is visible and it is punishable." Applause followed, cautious but real. The standoff was no longer a distant political duel. It was a lived collision between two clocks, one biting through finance, the other hammering through sovereignty. Burkina Faso was bleeding but not breaking. Each hour survived became another stone in a wall of defiance. And yet the foreign clock had not finished its count. With the 48th hour upon them, the question sharpened. Could the fragile system built from grit and improvisation outlast the machinery of global finance? Or would the mass snap before the 72-hour mark arrived? The 48th hour struck, and the streets of Ouagadougou held their breath. For weeks, rumors of collapse had swirled. Traders whispered of empty shelves, and mothers clutched purses already strained by the creeping rise of prices. The ultimatum from Washington had bitten deep: blocked transfers, frozen wires, and suspended foreign operations. Yet against that suffocating pressure, a different story was unfolding inside Burkina Faso itself. A story written in patience, resilience, and quiet acts of defiance. At the markets, stalls brimmed with smaller quantities. Sellers reduced bundles of grain, cut portions of cooking oil, and raised prices. Taxi drivers refused long journeys, calculating whether their fuel would last until the next shipment. In the countryside, families adjusted diets, substituting imported products with local harvests. It was not comfort, but it was survival. Each adjustment carried the unspoken recognition: the country was under siege, and endurance itself was a political act. Workers in the mining towns faced the sharpest shock. Salaries that once arrived through dollar channels now came as slips of gold-backed credits, redeemable only in local shops. At first, suspicion clouded the scheme. But as wages translated into bags of rice, maize, and fuel from redirected convoys, suspicion softened into cautious relief. What mattered was not prestige in the international system, but bread on the table. For villagers, the 72-hour order did not feel like a decree from above. It was lived reality. Elders convened nightly to guard depots. Youth groups rotated patrols, carrying radios and improvised drones overhead. Farmers who had long seen their soil drained for exports now spoke of ownership with a new vocabulary. Our gold, our oil, our land. Sovereignty had moved from speeches to watchtowers, from headlines to handshakes at midnight. Politically, the pressure was immense. Opposition voices questioned whether the government could sustain operations without foreign channels. Civil servants feared the collapse of payroll. Yet the response from the presidency was unwavering. Ministers were reminded that the struggle was not only financial, but existential. A battle over who decides the rules of engagement in the heart of the Sahel. The removal of 2 officials tied to suspicious transfers sent a blunt message. Loyalty was now tested not in words but in action. Each attempt at sabotage uncovered. Each convoy rerouted. Each community patrol strengthened the sense that this was not merely about policy but about dignity. For the first time in decades, the state's authority was reinforced not by external support, but by the mobilization of its own people. It was here that the wider meaning emerged. Commentators across Africa began to draw a parallel. What was unfolding in Ouagadougou was not an isolated quarrel, but part of a longer struggle, an anti-colonial Africa moment in miniature. The sight of villagers defending depots, of miners paid in gold slips rather than dollar transfers, of engineers wearing improvised surveillance grids, carried symbolic power far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Resilience carried a price. Inflation crept upward, and the poorest bore the heaviest burdens. Families rationed meals, shopkeepers argued with customers, and whispers of uncertainty traveled faster than official statements. Yet beneath the hardship, there was pride. Pride that the nation had not folded. Pride that the rules were being written in Ouagadougou, not dictated from Washington. By the 60th hour, the mood shifted from fear of collapse to recognition of endurance. International outlets ran headlines of crisis. Yet on the ground, the system, however fragile, still functioned. Wages were paid. Trucks, escorted and delayed, still delivered grain. Depots, threatened and sabotaged, still stood under local guard. The crisis had not vanished, but it had not broken the state. Inside the political sphere, debate grew sharper. Should the government extend concessions to foreign firms threatening withdrawal, or should it allow them to depart, proving the cost of non-compliance? In the end, Traoré's words closed the argument. If they cannot operate under our law, they will not operate here. Those words resonated far beyond the ministries. They reached bus stops, tea shops, and courtyards, where ordinary citizens repeated them as proof that their struggle was not in vain. The 72-hour order had become more than a policy. It was a mirror of sovereignty tested in real time. It revealed fractures in the economy, exposed vulnerabilities in infrastructure, and forced a population into improvisation. Yet it also awakened something long dormant, the belief that survival, even under siege, was a form of victory. But even as resilience deepened, the red markers on the control room map still pulsed. The foreign deadline had passed, yet its bite lingered. Could the fragile shield of community and willpower hold once the wider world recalculated its response? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the confrontation was reframed and replayed through countless lenses. In Washington and European capitals, the story became one of risk, instability, and the fragility of a small, landlocked nation cut adrift from the dollar system. Financial analysts predicted a run on reserves, speculators pressed against the local currency, and foreign media painted headlines of collapse. For many outside Africa, the 48-hour ultimatum was assumed to be decisive, the final word of power. Yet in the Sahel, a different truth was taking shape. As Burkina Faso endured sabotage, frozen transfers, and stalled convoys, its neighbors Mali and Niger began to mobilize. First came words of solidarity, then convoys of trucks carrying grain, fuel, and medicine across the borders. Cameras captured the images, long columns rolling into Ouagadougou under escort, greeted by cheering villagers. No speeches, no banners, only the unmistakable message that Burkina Faso was not alone. The symbolism was as potent as the supplies themselves. For decades, outside powers had treated the Sahel as a fractured space, defined by vulnerability and dependency. Now those same lines on the map blurred into a shield. The three nations stood shoulder to shoulder, not as clients of external powers, but as partners bound by necessity and choice. This moment redefined the confrontation. What international commentators had framed as a lonely gamble now appeared as a regional test of will. If Burkina Faso could draw strength from its neighbors, then Washington's pressure was no longer striking at a single nation but colliding with a bloc. The question shifted. Could external powers risk escalating into open confrontation with a region that had begun to discover its collective voice? Within Africa, commentators spoke of precedent. If one nation could withstand 48 hours of economic siege, supported by its neighbors, might others follow? The debate reached beyond policy into the realm of identity, whether the continent would continue to accept terms set abroad or insist on rules written at home. The phrase repeated in markets and courtyards was simple yet transformative. We are not isolated. We are defended. In this sense, the 72-hour order had transcended its original frame. It was no longer only about mines and permits or gold and oil. It was about a broader principle, the assertion of African sovereignty in the face of economic coercion. Each convoy that crossed the border, each truckload of grain or medicine that reached the capital, was more than relief. It was a declaration that the Sahel could protect its own. And as the clocks approached their final hours, the world's gaze sharpened. Would the new shield of Sahel unity hold under pressure? Or would external powers find ways to fracture it before the 72-hour mark arrived? By the 66th hour, the shape of the confrontation had shifted. What had begun as a duel between a superpower and a single Sahelian nation now looked like the unveiling of a regional alliance. Grain trucks from Bamako entered Ouagadougou markets. Fuel depots, once running dry, filled again under armed guard. Medicine was delivered directly to hospitals, easing the fears of families who had braced for shortages. Life, fragile but tangible, continued despite the blockade. The images told the story better than any speech. Cameras captured Ibrahim Traoré standing shoulder to shoulder with leaders of Mali and Niger at the border, watching convoys roll in. No grand declarations, no choreographed theatrics, only presence. That presence spoke louder than words. Burkina Faso was not abandoned. The Sahel stood as one. In the streets, the mood turned from dread to defiance. Radios that had once broadcast warnings now played victory songs. Children waved flags. Shopkeepers opened shutters with renewed confidence. The message was simple. The nation had endured. For every family that had rationed meals, for every miner who had accepted gold slips instead of dollars, for every village that had guarded depots through the night, the 72 hours had transformed suffering into pride. For outside observers, the narrative now appeared reversed. Instead of a small state crushed by external pressure, the story was of a fragile but unbroken system. Instead of isolation, there was solidarity. And instead of a countdown to collapse, there was a countdown to survival reimagined as sovereignty. Yet even as the celebration swelled, questions lingered. How long could this improvised system hold without reintegration into global finance? Could regional solidarity grow into a sustainable economic framework? Or was it only a temporary shield? Would other African nations follow the path carved in these 72 hours? Or would they hesitate at the price of confrontation? For Traoré, the message was already clear. At hour 72, he addressed his people not with triumphalism, but with conviction. We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and we made it real. The words echoed across courtyards and radios, a reminder that sovereignty was not granted but claimed, hour by hour, step by step. The 72-hour order ended not as a gamble lost or won, but as a foundation laid. A fragile foundation, yes, one built under siege, tested by sabotage, scarred by hardship, yet still standing. And in that survival was a new seed planted in the soil of the Sahel, nourished by sacrifice, guarded by unity. If one landlocked nation, pressured and cornered, can endure 72 hours against the weight of a global system, what stops the rest of a continent from doing the same? The 72 hours ended not with silence, but with sound. Markets reopened, radios carried songs of triumph, and children waved flags in the streets of Ouagadougou. Against every prediction of collapse, Burkina Faso stood. The 48-hour ultimatum had passed into noise, while the 72-hour order became law. What began as survival now felt like the birth of a foundation. Fragile, contested, but undeniably real. For Ibrahim Traoré, the message was simple yet profound. Our gold, our oil, our land, no longer decided abroad. It was not poetry, but policy lived hour by hour. Wages had been paid, convoys had arrived, sabotage had been confronted, and solidarity had been proven. In those 72 hours, sovereignty ceased to be theory. It became action, visible in drone patrols, grain deliveries, and miners' payslips. Beyond Burkina Faso, the symbolism traveled fast. Commentators spoke of an anti-colonial Africa moment, where a single landlocked nation defied the machinery of global finance and lived to tell its story. It was not a revolution of armies, but of endurance. Not victory by conquest, but survival as defiance. And in that defiance, the rest of the continent saw a mirror, a possibility that the old script of dependency could be rewritten. The presence of Mali and Niger at Traoré's side deepened that meaning. The convoys they sent were not just supplies. They were proof that solidarity could be weaponized into survival. The phrase whispered in courtyards, "We are not isolated. We are defended," carried the seed of something larger, a Sahel shield, a future where African sovereignty was not demanded but enacted. Of course, challenges remain. Fragile systems must mature into lasting frameworks. Regional solidarity must translate into structures that outlive the urgency of siege. But the precedent cannot be erased. 72 hours under siege did not break Burkina Faso. They forged it. And so the question remains, if one nation can withstand 48 hours of pressure with 72 hours of defiance, what might an anti-colonial Africa achieve if it speaks not as fragments, but as a whole? If this resonates with your sense of justice, subscribe, share, and join the journey. Because history is not finished.